Welcome to the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at the Federalist. You can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. I'm coming to you today from Washington, D.C., where our guest is Inez Feltscher Stepman. Inez is a senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum. She writes for us all the time at the Federalist, and we're having Inez on the show today to talk about a particularly interesting piece she wrote last week. Inez, thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here back on the Federalist Radio Hour. I missed it so much when it was gone. I'm an avid listener too. So when you guys went on to terrestrial radio, it was like a hole in my life. So I'm glad it's back.
Oh, back and thriving, as evidenced by you coming on the show today to talk to us about the intersection of, well, actually I should say, where Lana Del Rey and Phyllis Schlafly, I think, share parallel frustrations from different decades. But Inez has made a really fascinating connection between what's happened on Mrs. America, which just finished its 10-episode run, and what happened with the controversy over Lana Del Rey, who got in hot water basically for saying that she was not a feminist. Those are her words. I'm not a feminist, but she was tired of basically feminist music critics and writers coming after her and saying she glorifies abuse. And so, Inez, why don't we start off by you just explaining what you saw as the connection between Phyllis Schlafly's depiction on Mrs. America and the controversy over Lana?
Yeah, because I'm sure a lot of people, they hear that off the bat and they think, Glenn Beck with the board and the lines thing, various. No, but I really do think there's a connection here, and that's the undervaluing of the feminine, right? And so in Mrs. America, or in the actual battle over the ERA, right, you had this division between women. On the one hand, essentially saying that they wanted to live their lives more like men, and they wanted to be valued on the personality traits and accomplishments that men would be valued. And that's great for some percentage of women, but there are certainly a lot of women who are they don't feel good about being evaluated that way. And I think that's kind of what I saw Lana Del Rey saying, which is, I think she said something along the lines of there has to be a place in feminism for women like me. And previously she said, she's been my favorite for a while, because she said previously feminism is boring. And that got her into trouble last time several years ago. But I think what she means by that is she wants to focus on what are more traditionally feminine themes in her songs. A lot of her songs are about, being in love with the wrong man who treats her badly. That's hardly a genre she invented, right? That goes all the way back, long before, like Billie Holiday's famous for doing it, but of course it goes back long before that as well. It's as old as time. And she was comparing the themes in her songs to some of the themes of some of the other pop stars, and that's kind of what got her in trouble on the internet. They had a bunch of fandoms for these other women who came after her, but she basically said they can celebrate, and she didn't say it in these words, but I will rephrase this. They can celebrate having sex like men. They can celebrate having a different man in their bed every night and being, naked and running around, and call that empowerment. But they accuse me of glorifying abuse when I talk about some of the bad, or sing about some of the bad love affairs that I've had in the past. And look, to be clear, I'm not holding up Lana Del Rey as some kind of role model for girls. I don't think that the love affairs she describes in her songs are make people happy in the long run. But I do think they're a more sort of feminine road to ruin, right? A more traditional way that women direct their lives down the tubes, versus trying to brag about like how many men you can get in your bed, especially for some of these pop star women who are, they're beautiful women. It's not actually that difficult as a beautiful woman to find a different guy to sleep with every night if that's what you want to do. But it's a very masculine celebration of sort of quote unquote empowerment. And I think it's interesting that that's all totally okay. And that's what Lana Del Rey was pointing out. That's totally okay. It's totally okay to celebrate the masculine version, and women essentially performing the way that men would, or behaving the way that men have for centuries. But it's not okay for me to celebrate this very feminine and difficult love affairs that I've had or whatever. So I think that the thread is the devaluing of the feminine and feminine qualities in women.
Right, and that there's what feminists and sort of, it's broader than the feminist movement, because I think there are people that are like in the halls of power in media and in Hollywood that aren't necessarily like feminist activists, but have sort of like through osmosis absorbed the feminist standards, or at least conform to the feminist standards for what it means to be a woman and what is acceptable, what's an acceptable depiction of someone like Phyllis Schlafly, because either because they actually believe that or because out of fear of the backlash. And I think what you're saying is that those people insist on a very insist and enforce a narrow boundaries for what it means to be a woman and the types of women that we are allowed to listen to and allowed to elevate. Like with Lana Del Rey, for instance, I think a really important question is Lana Del Rey glamorizing her abuse, or is she just a glamorous person who struggles with abuse? Is she just a glamorous person who includes this as part of her art and struggles with it as part of her art? I don't think any of what she does endorses abuse by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, no, I don't think it endorses abuse either, but it certainly adds a sort of dark glamour to, you know, I'm so in love with this man, even though he treats me badly. I'll never. But again, this is not new, right?
Right.
Being in the submissive role to sort of aggressive and sometimes abusive men is a story that you know, women have dealt with going all the way back in time, and it's been given the artistic treatment. But I want to connect it to something else you said, which is these, you know, what voices get heard in the public square, right? And ultimately, you know, it's not that important. I know, Emily, you're the culture editor, but ultimately, you know, even though it's very important on the abstract level, like this spat between Lana Del Rey and, like, you know, Beyonce is not that important. But I do think that it ties back to something that Helen Andrews wrote in the New York Times about what voices, essentially, where are the housewives that Phyllis Schlafly organized? Do they still exist? Where are the socially conservative women? And our public square is very difficult, even more so, I think, than it was in the 70s, for women who have some of those traditional feminine qualities, who are gentle, a little bit reserved, they're sensitive. It's especially difficult for a woman like that to speak up now in the public square with cancel culture, with how, like, aggressive politics is. And they show a little bit about that in Mrs. America, but they sort of spin it as these women are terrified to leave their homes or whatever. And look, as somebody, and I think maybe something I share with you, like, I don't think we're afraid to share our opinions. We are sort of well designed personality-wise for this public square and for the fight and the rumble. But I think a lot of women aren't, more so than men. Of course, there are exceptions on both sides, but a lot of women aren't, and it makes them intimidated to actually enter when everything is so pugnacious in the public square, where sharing their opinions can get them called, you know, racist, sexist, homophobic, whatever. A lot of, I think, ironically, this entire orientation of our culture that demands from women that they be more like men makes a lot of women less likely to actually engage with the broader culture. And I think that's what Helen was kind of asking, like, where are these women? I think a lot of them are at home, they're raising families, they're, you know, they have a lot of day-to-day responsibilities, and this really pugnacious sort of fight that's going on outside of their doors seems to them to be something that they don't want to engage with. And I think that's a shame, right? We need some of their voices. We can't have the quote unquote women's movement only speak for the women who are have the personalities that are most likely to sort of get onto the public stage and go debate. If it's going to represent women, it has to represent some of those women who are more gentle, who don't want to offend anyone, who are more sensitive and perhaps not like Phyllis Schlafly and not willing to get up on that stage and trade word barbs with people. in the national eye. So that's why I think why Phyllis Schlafly was so important, because she essentially, and the show and feminists since then have called her a hypocrite for it, right? Essentially that she was ambitious and aggressive and knew her own mind very, very strongly and had no problem sharing her opinions, that she was a hypocrite. But she was standing up for the views of women that she saw all around her and who just weren't prepared to get and jump out into politics. They would find that, something that they're not equipped for and something they wouldn't enjoy. And so the fact that she was able to use the personality traits that she had to speak for those women, I think that's what created the magic in the 70s, where they stopped something that, I mean, look, it's hard even, I don't know today that we could stop anything like this, right? You have, the ERA was endorsed by both political parties. It was in both political party platforms. It had gotten 2/3 of both houses of Congress, more than 2/3, so it had passed that. And 35 states had ratified. And essentially, one woman organizing housewives brought that all to a halt. And it's an incredible feat of political organizing and grassroots momentum. But I think it's exactly because she did speak for so many women who were sort of silently shaking their head and not really sharing their voice in the public square.
Yeah, and it gets to this issue of representation, which is something that the left talks about a lot, and it's actually something that I completely agree with. I mean, they often talk about it in the context of television and movies, saying that the characters on television and movies, like the demographic breakdown or the sex breakdown, should mirror the demographics of the population. Well, I think that very firmly about class, and I think that very firmly about ideology. I think those are really important points, and I think that's what you're really hitting at here, is there's no representation of people who think anything, slightly to the right of like Noam Chomsky in media. Like it's not, and people who want to do that
on social issues, right? You can have a sense on fiscal issues, although that usually devolves also into identity politics. If you support tax cuts, it's because you want to hurt minorities and women or whatever. But there's some room for dissent in mainstream TV, for example. But I actually think that's why Meghan McCain gets attacked so disproportionately. I feel like I don't have a TV, so I don't watch The View, but I feel like every time she trends, it's for saying something that is completely middle of the road, completely reasonable, sounds totally normal to 50-60% of the country, and not even just conservatives, right? And oh yeah. But it's so shocking to hear that on mainstream TV that she ends up trending on Twitter for that. And it's because she's, for example, pro-life. Like that. Look, there are a lot of pro-life women in America, and men obviously, but women in particular. Like I think that's why she seems to irritate people so much in the mainstream media, because, as you say, there is no representation, and particularly of social conservatives, and particularly of social conservative women.
Yeah, no, that's completely right. And it's not even just like, it really goes beyond social conservatives at this point to, I don't even think you can call it cultural conservatives, but like cultural anti-leftists, like people who don't agree with political correctness or like the standards of political correctness as they are enforced by people in power in the media and in Hollywood. And it's funny that you brought up, I think you're completely right about Meghan McCain. I think that's exactly what happens. It's that like something that wouldn't raise anybody's eyebrows at a barbecue in, Illinois, if you say it on a national television platform, the media, which is largely based in urban coastal centers, New York, DC, LA, freaks out because nobody around them talks like that. And as far as they're concerned, it's bigoted and hateful because that's what they've been taught. And that's the standards that are upheld where they live and by the people they surround themselves with. It's funny that you brought up the Helen Andrews op-ed in the New York Times, though, which I believe was written last year. Right. And she was like basically asking where the millennial Phyllis Schlafly is. And I raised that question to Phyllis Schlafly's daughter on Federalist Radio Hour back in March before Mrs. America started, Anne Schlafly Corey, and her answer was basically that her mom was successful in creating basically an army of conservative women, as evidenced, you know, by people like the women who write for the Federalist and the women of IWF, and like the conservative movement being full of women, which it is full of women. But I thought that that answer was very interesting, that there isn't just one Phyllis Schlafly now, there's many. But Inez is really an expert on the Equal Rights Amendment and the ERA. And that gets us to the point that, like, there really was only one Phyllis Schlafly. Like, there can't be many Phyllis Schlaflys, because Phyllis Schlafly is such a singular character, such a singular force in American history, and certainly behind the conservative movement as it propelled Ronald Reagan to the presidency, which Mrs. America touched on. But yeah, can you talk to us just a little bit about, as someone who studies the ERA closely, what it took for Phyllis Schlafly, even if Gloria Steinem downplays Phyllis Schlafly's role in halting the ERA, what it took for someone like Phyllis Schlafly to lead that movement?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think it's one of the most remarkable political achievements of certainly of the last, you know, half century or 60 years, because this train had left the station, right? And just before I get into the history of the ERA, I do want to make one comment about the sort of democratization of Schlafly's, or
yeah.
I'm not sure that does the trick, for the reasons that we were talking about. I think there are a lot of women who need to be able to look up to figures in mainstream media who articulate some of the things that they believe. And I think part of yes, the Federalist listserv of women is in some ways the heirs to Phyllis Schlafly, but we don't have a mainstream voice, right?
Yeah.
The equivalent of Gloria Steinem is not going to debate like me or you or Joy, right?
Right.
On Meet the Press, right? Like, so I think that's one of the things that she did remarkably well, was actually, and they ding her for it in the series. They make it seem like she's completely self-aggrandizing. She just wants to be in front of the spotlight. But the reality is the fact that she was able to go out and, you know, I mean, I highly recommend everybody go back and watch some of her debates with Betty Friedan.
Yeah.
They're fantastic. And she was so sharp. It's well worth watching. Also, she went on Firing Line with Bill Buckley, and that's also well worth watching. And she was definitely a very sharp spokeswoman for her cause. But yeah, I think that is different, right? I think you do need some amount of mainstream visibility, because a lot of the women that you're trying to reach are exactly not going to be reading the Federalist because they aren't all that political, right?
Yeah, yep, 100%. Those are the voices that need to be elevated, the people who are like not in the arena, like the people who do really just like stay at home, take care of their kids, and, you know, they are really active in their church, whatever it is. Those are not the people that we hear from in the media, even among conservatives.
Right. I think even in the conservative movement, it's so rare. And that's why part of the reason I think the conservative movement has not been very successful in pushing back on any of the cultural issues, right? When we have political power, we pass tax cuts, and that seems to be the only thing the Republican Party can do. I like tax cuts as much as anyone else, but we've been losing on some of these cultural issues for decade after decade after decade. You know, this stopping the ERA, now that I think about it, might be one of the very few cultural political victories that the conservative movement has under its belt.
You know what's interesting is when you were talking about that earlier, is I was thinking the ERA is almost like Hillary Clinton, in that when Hillary Clinton was elected, you had she's sort of like the personification of the ERA, because when she lost the election, you had the Republican Party, you had high profile Republicans, the Never Trump Republicans, essentially endorsing Hillary Clinton, saying they were going to vote for Hillary Clinton. You had the Democratic Party essentially saying they were going to vote for Hillary Clinton. And that was kind of the one thing, I think a huge reason that Donald Trump actually won the Electoral College and was so successful, especially in some of those Rust Belt states, is because of cultural issues. Like the cultural, what he represented on a cultural level was a pushback against political correctness. It was a pushback against media bias, and against frankly just distrust in media. So I think, you know, the reason that he resonated with so many people in those areas was because he basically had media bias as a platform, and he basically had political correctness as a platform. And I don't think we can necessarily count Donald Trump as a cultural victory for the conservative movement, but there is still like the grassroots, when it wants to mobilize against the elites. I guess in terms of that election, there may be some signs of life among the grassroots. I mean, Bernie Sanders was able to be a major nominee.
I was going to bring up Bernie because I think I know that there's been a number of different explanations offered for why he didn't do as well this year. But I think as something you brought up in the past, perhaps it's the fact that he sort of was dragged kicking and screaming into wokedom, and he had to definitely shore up that side of his left flank by talking a lot more about various politically correct issues, about intersectionality and all that stuff. And I think that's just solidified the fact that a lot of the voters who had voted for Bernie and then voted for Donald Trump in the Rust Belt, right, in 2016, because he spoke to them on trade and anti-political correctness, I think it solidified a lot of that move towards the Republican Party. And I don't think the Democratic Party, even though more and more people in the Democratic Party are okay with socialism, they're okay with the economic side of Bernie's platform. I think in terms of the cultural issues, they're painting themselves into a corner where they're going to be the party of essentially the affluent elite. And we see that demographically. We see the parties are changing. The Republican Party is winning over a lot more working class voters, and I think it's on those issues. So it'll be interesting to see how the parties realign. But I do want to perhaps return to the ERA if we have the time to do that.
Well, yeah, because Inez freaked me out badly on a night last fall. We were having a conversation, and Inez was sort of like steeped in this ERA issue, and she was working on it really hard as states were trying to ratify the ERA again. And Inez was like, there is a serious chance that this happens. There's a serious chance that, like, depending on where the country goes, the ERA could be passed in the near future. Talk to us a little bit about this. Try not to terrify us too much. Actually, you know what? It's probably good if we're terrified.
Yeah, I call it a sleeper issue for the last, as you said, I've been working on this for like a couple of years, because what changed, all the history books have essentially said Phyllis Schlafly killed the ERA, right? And what changed is that a law student wrote a paper. Well, really what changed is that we passed the 27th Amendment, 26th, 27th, the one about congressional pay, right? Mm-hmm. So that had been introduced by James Madison as part of the original Bill of Rights. So it was one of the two that did not get ratified back in the beginning of the country, and then was reinvigorated and passed again without starting the clock over by the Newt Gingrich Congress, right? So, and it's about Congress paying itself, and frankly, Congress ignores it all the time, which is sort of interesting. Courts have not really enforced that amendment, and perhaps the weird ratification process has something to do with that. But the bottom line is that we ratified that amendment over the course of 200 years. And so some law student wrote a paper saying, well, if they can do that, well, how come we can't just keep going with the ERA, even though Congress had set this deadline? And then you hear them at the end of This is America talk about the illegitimate move to actually dissolve that deadline and extend it by several years. Obviously, we were well past that deadline as well, and everyone had assumed this amendment was dead. But they revived it with this legal theory, which the legal theory will go to the courts. And I think that we have a fairly strong case that you cannot ratify an amendment over an indeterminate amount of time. You cannot ignore congressional deadlines once they're inserted. So even if it's okay to ratify an amendment over an enormous amount of time, Congress set a very specific window of time for this to happen, and it missed it. So I think that we have some strong arguments in court, but I'd like to stop it before it gets to court. And so in between, I think as I think the series did include the third and last state. So there was a ratification in Virginia, 38th state, if you count all of the states that ratified in the 1970s, and you don't count the 5 states that either had sunset clauses or rescinded their ratification. So Phyllis Schlafly actually convinced a bunch of states that had previously ratified the ERA to rescind that ratification. And so that's another issue that's going to go to the courts. But the House recently voted to dissolve the deadline, as noted in Mrs. America. The Senate looks like it's not going to pick this up. I'm quite nervous that if they do pick it up, we'll see Republican defections on this issue, because Republicans are so terrified always of being called sexist. Yeah. And so I've been working as hard as I can the last couple years to try to alert conservatives to the dangers of this amendment, which I really think will provide an open-ended, hopper for a lot of liberal and progressive ideas to be implemented through the courts.
Well, and Republicans won't just be called sexist, and that's what gets to what makes, in my opinion, the Equal Rights Amendment more dangerous now than it was before, because Republicans will be called anti-LGBT, and that's because of the gender identity issue that exists now and exists in this current iteration of the ERA in a way it did not in the 70s. And so it brings in an entirely new conversation and an entirely new, I think, threat to norms and like what that would do legally, the consequences legally of that is another question entirely. Can you speak to some of what the modern dangers of passing the ERA are? I'm not particularly afraid of being drafted, but talk a little bit about like what we would expect. Say Democrats win the Senate and they have the House, they have the Senate, they have the presidency. What would the country look like?
So let's start with the text of it. It sounds very, I think, nice to the typical person. It's no discrimination, no state shall discriminate on the basis of sex, right? So actually in Mrs. America, my friend Bill Maddox, who works at the James Madison Institute down in Florida, said you have to mention, if you're going to talk about it, you have to mention the intro of Mrs. America, where they type out the words of the amendment, and they have housewives coming with Hoover vacuums to vacuum up the words, which is part of the little introduction they have there. So that's a nice image. But so it sounds pretty basic on its face, but there are enormous problems with what it could implement into the Constitution. So for starters, you mentioned the word sex is somewhat more debatable in 2020 than it was in 1978, where even Phyllis Schlafly could not imagine that the word sex would be ambiguous, that biological sex would be ambiguous. And so that's perhaps another reason why we shouldn't ratify amendments over such long periods of time, because as any good originalist like Scalia and his old dictionaries would know, the public meaning of words changes over time. And even though they might be the same words, they might have a completely different meaning in 2020 than they did in 1970. And so that's, in fact, the ERA was written all the way back in 1923. And I can guarantee you that Alice Paul, the suffragette who wrote it, she did not think that she was talking about men who identify as women or women who identify as men. But nevertheless, that's a real possibility, that it would be interpreted that way through the courts, that it would enshrine something close to a civil rights protection for gender identity, which, the consequences of that would be enormous, right? So, but actually a lot of the consequences of the ERA almost would make that issue a sidebar, because right now we're essentially talking about what to do with exceptions, right? A very small percentage of people who feel that they're the opposite sex than their biological sex and want to participate in various single-sex activities on the basis of the sex that they think they are. To some extent, the ERA would make that moot because you wouldn't have to claim to identify as the opposite sex. You would simply say, you're discriminating against me on the basis of my sex, and that's unconstitutional. So, for example, if you're a guy who wants to run on a public university women's track team, you don't really have to say, I identify as a woman. You can just say, I want to run on this track team. I'm a man. You are keeping me out exactly because I'm a man, and that's a discrimination on the basis of sex. And so, in some sense, it would blow up the issue we're dealing with in a very narrow sense with gender identity now, and blow it up to be more universal. So some of the impacts that I think would be potentially issues that would go to court, and depending on the shape of the court system, they would go one way or another. We sex segregate prisons, right? For very, very good common sense reasons. We sex segregate prisons because women are more vulnerable if they're put in to lock up with men. But that's a discrimination on the basis of sex, right? So I mentioned sports teams, any kind of public restroom, right? So whether in public buildings, which include public schools, right? So the whole bathroom debate that we're having again in the transgender context just would blow up to to universal levels, right? So you don't have to claim to identify as a woman if you are a 16-year-old guy in high school who would like to use the women's locker room. You just can simply say they're keeping me out on the basis of my sex. So overall, what this amendment claims to enshrine basic constitutional rights for women, basic equality under the law. We already have that in America.
I was just gonna ask, right.
We have had that for a very long time in the United States, but in case one was worried, nobody claims that women don't have, for example, that the Bill of Rights doesn't attach to women, that we don't have the right to trial by jury, the right to speak, the right to bear arms, just as men do. The 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, protects equality under the law between men and women, but critically allows for states to sometimes advance rationales why they might treat men and women differently, such as in prisons, for example, right? Because there's a lower tier of scrutiny. The court requires less of an extreme reason to treat the sexes differently than they do if a state were to discriminate on the basis of race, for example.
So pretend you're a feminist and argue for me, what problem does this solve?
So the weird thing is there's this huge bifurcation between the proponents of the ERA. So if you talk to the legal side of things, if you talk to the lawyers who are advancing the ERA, they basically say this is not going to change a whole lot. This is going to raise sex discrimination to heightened scrutiny, the way that race discrimination is in the analysis that the court is going to do. It's going to require a very, very, very good reason to discriminate between men and women, but the impact will be relatively small. That if you talk to the legal side, if you talk to the proponents, they say that it will solve the Me Too problem. They say that it will solve the pay gap. They say that it will solve all kinds of things. That there were multiple people during the House hearing who testified about Me Too and the pay gap, as though this amendment, even in the very broad interpretation that I think the left will use it for in the courts, there's nothing it's going to do about Me Too necessarily.
How
right?
could it?
It's a criminal matter. Harassment is a criminal matter. It's illegal to harass people. It is illegal to sexually assault women already.
On the basis of sex, according to the Civil Rights Act.
Right, and sex discrimination is also forbidden by, as you mentioned, Title VII in federal law and by all 50 states in state law. So if it's narrow, if it's as narrow as some of the proponents want to say it is, it's not necessary, right? But the problem is that I don't believe that it will be kept narrow. I think that there's a real chance that it moves the court from a somewhat reasonable position. I still think that actually the current position of the courts actually has gone too far in terms of not recognizing reasons why treating men and women differently might make sense under the law. But it still leaves some wiggle room for some very basic common sense things like keeping prisons segregated. It allows keeping public restrooms for men and women in our schools, for example. So all of those issues where treating men and women differently actually makes perfect sense. I'll give you another example that is, again, something we're dealing with in a transgender context, but would make that issue much, much worse. This would apply to any organization that takes federal money or state money, so any government money whatsoever. Most battered women's shelters get some kind of grants from either the city, the state, or the feds. It would be a discrimination on the basis of sex for them to keep men out of battered women's shelters. So, which is a literal thing that's happening in Alaska. Yes. So there's a case up in Alaska, and that's related to the transgender issue. But again, now you don't even need to identify, right? Under the ERA, you can just say, hey, I want to be in the battered women's shelter. And for example, the fact that women might be uncomfortable with the, especially after coming out of a domestic violence situation, the fact that women might want a space that is just women is not a good enough reason under a strict interpretation of the ERA. Ruth Bader Ginsburg has suggested also that all kinds of programs that give some kind of benefit to stay-at-home wives and mothers. So again, we return to Phyllis Schlafly's housewives not wanting to lose their privileges. For example, spousal Social Security, it used to be just for women. They have broadened the language. They've made it sex neutral, the language. So now it's spousal Social Security, but a non-working spouse can draw on partial Social Security of his or her spouse's life's work, right, and paying into Social Security. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's a big proponent of the amendment, she has suggested in her past legal work that in fact, any kind of program that offers what amounts to a subsidy for women staying home is actually in violation of an equality principle. So just to see how far this could expand, we could start looking at every law that has a different impact on men than women, and come at it with the presumption that it's discrimination at work. And that, I mean, there are endless consequences of that. I mean, that is a license for the federal courts to overturn hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, perhaps thousands of laws that, in some small way recognize the fact that men and women are different. They make different choices. And so I think that very quickly could develop into a quite tyrannical regime. And this is basically what Phyllis Schlafly pointed out. She had different examples because the times were different, but she had the same core argument, which is men and women are different in important ways, not just in totally superficial ways, in important ways. And those differences do manifest themselves in different choices and different values and different ways that men and women want to live their lives. And so the courts and our law have to be able to recognize the differences between men and women. We can't have equality become some kind of undifferentiated sameness between men and women that doesn't recognize that we're different, because that's actually very bad for women. It makes women more vulnerable. It sometimes literally puts them in harm's way.
Yeah, right. And that's an argument you'd think the feminist movement would understand. And I actually have seen some people on the left acknowledge it, but not often enough. And to your point, I should have been more articulate about this earlier, but if you have, if the Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the presidency, the Equality Act will absolutely get passed. Like, there's just no question about that. And the Equality Act does conflate biological sex with gender identity. And so if you combine that with an equal rights amendment, all of the consequences that you just talked about are very real. And I think it's so interesting that you said, you explained how basically it would nullify any of the concerns about the legal ramifications of conflating biological and sex with gender identity, because it makes all discrimination complaints wherever sex is segregated, it legitimizes them, which is, I had not thought about it that way before, but that's also particularly interesting. And to your last point, you mentioned, so the show Mrs. America gets to this depiction of Phyllis Schlafly. It's sort of misdirection. It starts in this first episode with Phyllis Schlafly looking whip smart, extremely competent and capable, and then as time goes on, makes her look ill-informed and narcissistic and media starved for media attention. And everything that you just said, the consequences that you just outlined and what we've just talked about, were dismissed in the show and are continually dismissed as sort of the hysteria of crazy right-wingers, and that these are not rooted in any sense of reality. Back in the 70s, it was women will never be drafted, and then Betty Friedan would say, well, if they are, that's good, they should be. But your concerns would be, right now, completely dismissed as hysterical, rather than grounded in reality.
It's ironic for feminists to dismiss the concerns of women as hysterical, because of course that had the word itself, the root is female, right? Hyster, right? So it's female hysteria, perhaps. No, it's we see this dynamic a lot, I think, especially in the cultural issues, and part of the reason that conservatives feel so whiplashed, right, is it seems like we're made all kinds of promises every time one of these social issues, advances to the left, that, oh no, the things that we could imagine can't possibly be true. And look, we see it with the gay marriage debate, right? Because a lot of proponents of gay marriage argued initially that there's no way this is going to start affecting businesses or churches. Your right to conscience will be completely protected. It doesn't make any difference to you whether your gay friends can get married. And look, I have to say, to some extent, I bought those arguments. At the time, there's no sort of inevitable legal reason why that should be the case. But every single time, conservatives have been like Lucy in the football, right? We are made certain promises. We're told that our logical slippery slope arguments are fallacious and hysterical, and then 5 years rolls around, and in fact, make the things that conservatives argued might happen are now mandatory.
Right.
And that slope only seems to be accelerating. In terms of far out, I think all the predictions that I've made legally are very, very actually short order predictions. And in terms of, I think all we would need is a fifth vote on the Supreme Court to read the ERA as broadly as I've talked about with some of these consequences.
Right.
I fear, actually, if we want to get into more speculative territory, there is a legal theory that is now used under Title VII sometimes by some courts, but it's still a minority legal theory. It's called disparate impact theory, right? And it's used now, it's mostly talked about with regard to race. And the basic idea is it flips the presumption, the basic presumption of innocence on its head. And it says, okay, if there exists a racial disparity, for example, in a company's, payrolls or something like that, or in the way that a law is applied, right? So let's say that the consequences of a particular law have a racial disparity in how they shake out, right? I can imagine many laws like that, starting from criminal laws or there's just, the consequences are sort of endless, right? But the disparate impact analysis would say, okay, there's a disparity, therefore we presume that there's discrimination, and then the state or entity that's producing that disparity has to kind of prove that it's not due to discrimination. Mm. As bad as that would be for race, for sex, it would be so much worse. Mm-hmm. Because as women and men are biologically different, unlike the racial categories that are largely social distinctions, there are biological differences between men and women that are real and scientific and deeply ingrained, and not just the obvious physical differences where men are stronger than women are physically, but you can tell the difference. There's a fascinating study that came out a couple years ago. You can actually see the different brains developing between boys and girls in the womb. Like, you can tell by a scan of a baby's brain in the womb whether that baby is a boy or a girl. Our brains are wired actually quite differently. It produces different psychological traits. That's well known and well studied in the social sciences, right? So the idea that we would start from the assumption that everything in society has to be exactly 50-50, or between men and women, or there's discrimination involved, I think could have enormous and far-reaching consequences in law, in culture, and society. So that is a second order. They'd have to win a lot more judgeships to implement, I think, something like that. But I also don't think it's completely out of the question. If we do see a series of democratic elections, I could see the ERA wielded in this way, essentially against the different choices and lifestyles of women. And I think that's the thread here, really, with the women's movement, is that unless you make the right, quote unquote, choices, the choices that the feminist left finds valuable, or you value the character traits in yourself, or the activities in your life, or the career choices that the feminist left thinks you ought to, unless you make the decisions the way they want you to, they're not really actually a fan of the way that real women across the country make their decisions and organize their lives. There's something wrong with our choices. There's something wrong with us if we don't choose the way that the feminist left thinks that we should. So I think that's the overarching theme from criticizing Lana Del Rey for singing about something that women have sung about since the beginning of time, to wondering where some of the more conservative, social conservative voices among women are in our national discourse. I think it's the devaluing of the millions of women who are, enjoy making their lives in a more traditional feminine way, or creating their lives in a more traditional feminine way. And I think their voices are pretty much devalued across the board in this culture.
Yeah, and what's sort of irritating is that this isn't a larger part of our conversation in the conservative movement about the importance of the courts. The importance of the courts and judgeships are talked about in ways that rarely actually get to things like the ERA and how the Equality Act would be interpreted and all those good things. It's just really not a big part of the conversation. Also, by the way, to your point about the study with brain development in the womb, feminists would literally argue and do argue that social conditioning begins in the womb and thus may be impacting brain development. I like the way though that you brought this full circle, because I do think this is the major thread of what you're talking about, is that if you look at Lana Del Rey, what upset, apart from the fact that she named names and went after particular women in music, I think she named Beyonce and Ariana Grande and Miley Cyrus, aside from the fact that she did that, I think what was particularly irksome to the feminist left about what Lana did was she conceded feminine weakness in contrast with masculine strength. And that's something that a lot of women experience. Not all women experience it, but a lot of women in relationships sort of would this dynamic in a relationship would resonate with a lot of women, and she wasn't endorsing it, but she was.
No, it's always tragic, right? It's always tragic in her music. But the fact that I think that's a really good way to put it. She's acknowledging certain truths that a lot of women do play this role. I think she calls it a passive or submissive role in their relationships. And sometimes that's wonderful because the men involved are good human beings and good men. And sometimes that's the complementarity that I think a lot of religious groups encourage in marriages. But sometimes it gets very warped and very destructive. And I think that's what she is singing about. But I would bet that, and I don't have the social scientific evidence for this, but I would bet that if you took, let's say, a poll of several hundred or several thousand women and asked them a couple questions. One, do you feel empowered by sleeping with a lot of different men? And two, have you ever felt like your relationship was spinning out of your control, and that you didn't feel strong enough to push back against a man who had treated you in a way that you thought was bad or unfair? I'm very willing to place some good money on the fact that a lot more women would answer yes to question 2 than question 1. And that's why Lana's music, I think, connects with a lot of women. Now we can talk, again, I'm not endorsing this kind of relationship, but I don't think she is either. But it is a female experience that is out there.
Yes. Yeah, it's a female experience.
And I would wager that it's a lot more common female experience than the experience that's being sung about, by Ariana Grande, right? And so look, art has always taken painful parts of our lives and our history and turned them into something beautiful or not beautiful sometimes, as the case may be. But I do find it interesting that her art is the one that is forbidden. Like this road to ruin, I think I said in the questions that you sent me, this particular road to ruin, which sounds so familiar to so many women, this is the thing that we're not allowed to talk about, because it exactly acknowledges that women do sometimes play too passive a role in relationships that with men who take advantage of them for that femininity. And that's the one thing we're not allowed to talk about. We're totally allowed to talk about destroying ourselves in 1,000 other ways. But if we want to destroy ourselves in this way that's intimately connected with being a woman, that's forbidden. We can't talk about that.
Right, and Lana was saying, like, now that Miley and everyone else is being aggressively promiscuous and aggressively and overtly sexualized in their songs, I'm having this sort of like very expressive and emotional conversation about a dynamic that a lot of women fall into. It's just a different female experience. I like the phrase that you use. It's a different female experience. And to tie things full circle one more time, I just loved the point that you made, which is that Mrs. America continues to show the arbiters of our culture's intolerance for a different kind of female experience. And part of that is that they're just forcing one version of what the female experience should be down everybody's throats. And the other part of it is that they just like, there's no representation of those voices, and they have no interest in giving them any representation. I just thought that was a pretty important point. Loved that you wrote it up for us. I think the piece is really helpful.
I add one consequence. I know you're wrapping up here.
Yeah,
but,
no. Add a consequence.
One consequence of that, I think, and the reason that I do care a lot about these issues is a great deal of unhappiness that I think is look. So, suffering in life is unavoidable. What's the line from The Princess Bride? Anyone else is selling something? Life is pain.
I hate that movie.
Who says something otherwise is selling something. But I do think there's a lot of avoidable pain in our culture, especially when it comes to the relationships between men and women understanding each other a little better. I think our culture is quite destructive of the ability of men and women to actually understand each other, understand how we might see the world differently, and understand how to deal with the differences, and how in fact to enjoy the differences between us. And I think there's quite a lot of evidence that women are much more unhappy actually now than they were in decades prior. And certainly I think in 2020 it's become clear nobody is happy with the state of the relations between the sexes, right? The left has one set of solutions which largely amount to try to like some kind of legalistic regulation to try to jam into, for example, concepts like Title IX, harassment, consent, what are essentially bad dates and bad relationships and bad sex. They try and that has gotten very dangerous and tyrannical for men, because it's essentially made it illegal to have a bad date on college campuses. I'm being facetious, but only a little bit. There is a real legal minefield now out there for men who fail to read some subtle cue from a woman who is less than happy than what she projects. But on the flip side, there are a lot of women, I think, who are deeply unhappy with the dating culture, quote unquote dating. It's not really dating anymore. And we see in surveys that female happiness has declined decade after decade after decade. So even the solutions of the left and right are totally different, and I completely reject the solutions of the left to this problem. I do think that there's a certain agreement now, in a way there wasn't, I think, in the heyday of the sexual revolution in the 1970s and early 80s. I think there's an agreement that our sexual culture is broken, that the relationships between men and women in our culture are broken. It's just that now we have very, very different answers to that problem. But it's interesting to me how since the 70s, we've moved from a point where the left was insisting that they could remake human nature, that they could remake male and female nature, they could take all the guardrails off of sexual relations, and it would be a big party and everyone would have a great time. I think in 2020, the left and the right recognize that that's not true, but they just have very different ways of dealing with that underlying unhappiness.
Yeah, that's the Aziz Ansari story is what really allowed the Me Too movement to crystallize the overlap between the left and the right on the brokenness, the utter brokenness of our sexual relations. And I mean, both of us, I'm sure, would squarely pin the blame on the sexual revolution and the feminist movement's propulsion of the sexual revolution. But I think we're only beginning to reckon with the consequences of the sexual revolution on the millennial generation, which really was the first generation, that's our generation, by the way, it was really the first generation to go through, to have like the dominant far left feminist worldview be the dominant cultural worldview for our childhood. Yeah, right. And so this is like a conversation that we should continue having on another episode, because we could go on forever. And we definitely have to have Inez back in June, because she has a white paper on education policy coming out. So stay tuned to IWF for that. You can read Inez's article on the overlap between Phyllis Schlafly and Lana Del Rey up on the Federalist. But Inez, thank you so much for being here. We'll have Inez back soon. We will also be back with the show tomorrow for more. And until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.